everyone, and welcome to episode 88 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. One of the things that makes history so interesting to me is that some of the biggest, most influential shifts and changes occur as the result of a single moment in time. When we trace back how we got to this moment, we can see how chance and human emotion, impulse, and even folly have shaped everything we know, from politics to technology to culture. One of these moments, one that was to send shockwaves through history, took place 900 years ago on November 25th, 1120, when William Atheling, the 17-year-old heir to the throne of England, set foot on a beautiful boat called La Blanche Nef, the White Ship. This week, I spoke with Charles Spencer about his new book, The White Ship, Conquest, Anarchy, and the Wrecking of Henry I's Dream. In addition to being the 9th Earl Spencer, Charles is the author of several books that feature pivotal moments in history, including Killers of the King, To Catch a King, and Blenheim, Battle for Europe. Here's our conversation about what happened the night of the White Ship disaster, how that single night changed the course of history, and why it's important to think of history in terms of human beings, their feelings, and their often fateful decisions. Well, thank you, Charles, for joining me to talk about the White Ship on the week of its 900th anniversary of the sinking.
Oh, thank you. What a pleasure for me.
And we spoke to each other on Instagram last week, so people can look up that video as well. But this is going to be kind of more to speaking to the medieval fans of the podcast. And this medieval world is not really something that you've delved into before this book, is it?
No, not at all. I looked up the papers I did at Oxford a very long time ago when I was at university. And this was the one I did best in, actually, the medieval period. And so, yeah, I've always had an affinity with it. But I actually started writing about the Stuart period, the 17th century in England. My last 3 books were on the Civil War that the British had in the 1640s. So there's another Civil War in here. So familiar territory, a bit of blood everywhere. And so I like a cracking tale. That's what it's about for me.
Yeah, I noticed that. I noticed that you write about civil wars. Apparently, it seems to be a theme.
Yes. And I think, I like to really tell the tale of a particular king through one flashpoint in his reign. So, for instance, 2 books ago, I did a book on Charles I, the people who were responsible for executing him. And they were chased around the world when Charles II, his son, came to power 11 years later. And then the last one I did was on Charles II, and it was about him on the run for his life for 6 weeks before he becomes king. So in that sort of construct, you can tell a much wider tale about a king. And this one's really about Henry I.
Yeah, I was thinking that. I don't want to say that it was a love letter to Henry I, because I think that's probably the wrong phrase, but it's definitely, I think we all have our favorite royal characters from history. And it seems like Henry is one of yours, is he?
I really like Henry because he's the right man for the time. Look, he was hard-nosed and he could be brutal. But I think your medieval fans will know far better than me that if you didn't take a pretty steady line with people, you were going to be the next victim yourself. And so I like the way, particularly compared to his brothers, one of whom, William Rufus, was King of England, and then his older brother, Robert Curthose, was Duke of Normandy. They both had huge failings as rulers. And Henry, I think he's pretty bulletproof on the main points of providing security and financial dependability and a very, very clever structure of government. He really did cover all the bases. But the one that was most important to a king at this time was providing an heir.
Yes. And that's actually where things start to go wrong. So let's get into the White Ship disaster. Henry I, he's been king for a while at this point, and he settled England and he settled Normandy. So set us the scene. What's going on just before the White Ship set sail?
Yes, I think this is a Greek tragedy, really, because we have the youngest son of William the Conqueror, Henry I, who's really destined to do not very much, probably have a very nice life. And he ends up seizing the throne when the King of England, his brother William, is killed in a freak hunting accident. And then he takes the Dukedom of Normandy off his brother Robert Curthose in battle. And then, he plows ahead really successfully as king and duke until 1120. And he seems to have everything settled. He has done the essential duty of an English king at this time of beating the French. He seems to be everything cleared, the decks cleared, to leave it to his one legitimate son, William Atheling. Atheling essentially means the next king. And we have in William Atheling this 17-year-old boy of some promise. He gets a rough ride in the Monk's Chronicles because they're trying to find a reason why God decided to take him from Earth, and it's sort of a bit prematurely. But I think he would possibly have grown into a decent man. We'll never know. And a lot of the medieval kings of England had a pretty rough teenagehood, such as Henry V. Was an appalling young man and then turned into one of our greatest kings. But Henry I's son looks set to take on all the prizes that his father has won. And it's very exciting. And so when Henry I, after 3 or 4 years of fighting the French, finally defeating them, getting the French king, Louis VI, to agree that William Atheling is going to be the next Duke of Normandy, he gets to the northern Norman harbour of Barfleur, ready to come back to England in triumph. And it looks like one of the most spectacular returns that any monarch will ever have had.
Yeah, and for the people who are, this is the medieval podcast, so this is our world, these are our people. You have a lot of descriptions in here kind of setting the actual moment for us, where you're describing what it might have been like for the ships to be prepared. And it's a beautiful scene because the weather was quite good in Barfleur that day. People were dressed up. They were ready to have a really triumphant return to England. So then what happens that night?
Well, I'll certainly answer that. But you talk about the description, and actually I'm very lucky because there were this was such an appalling thing that happened that a lot of people wrote about it. So I could piece together quite a scene. So I'm what's a narrative. I'm a narrative historian. I do academic work in it. There's a chapter about what the sea meant to the medieval mind, for instance, which is my own research. But a lot of it is using the primary sources to build a picture. Mm-hmm. And the picture we get of Barfleur on the evening of the 25th of November is one of great excitement, I think. The people returning home. These are Anglo-Norman families, often with their prime roots in England by this stage. And the king is returning, as we've established, in triumph, with many members of his family, his great knights, his churchmen, and leading courtiers. And also, Henry was a very effective monarch because he introduced a sort of parallel system of government through meritocracy. And the meritocrats were also getting on board these ships. And there was more than just the white ship setting sail that night. When the king entered Barfleur, a man stepped forward and reminded the king that it had been his own father who had been captain of the flagship of William the Conqueror in 1066 when he invaded England. And he demanded the honor of taking Henry I back to England in his great moment of triumph in the white ship. Now, what do we know about the white ship? We know that it probably was light in color. And I've done as much research as I can. Your subscribers will know that white was a celebratory color in the Viking Age. A lot of the early 12th century nautical traditions were very similar to what we will have seen in Viking ships. And there's been almost no change since the invasion of Normandy in ship design. It's a very, very large ship. It had 50 oarsmen. We know that the ones in the Bayeux Tapestry for the Normandy invasion of England in 1066, they probably had 16, or 20, or maybe 30, but no more than that. So a very substantial ship. And it was one that was obviously of great note because the captain boasts about it and nobody in the accounts quibbles with the account of that he gives it, the wonderful picture he gives of it being a fantastic vessel. But Henry I is one for tried and tested means, and he's decided that he's going to go back in his usual ship because that's what he does. and actually, it's so interesting how many times these rulers, when they had Normandy to look after, the English rulers were bustling backwards and forwards across the channel a lot, but very rarely so late in the year. Late November was a very strange time to be getting a ship. Most people tried to avoid the trans-channel crossing in the winter months or the days leading up to winter. But it was fine, as you said. There was nothing wrong with the weather. It was very, very cold, but the sea was calm, and the wind was just good enough to take ships back to England. And a huge celebration. And Henry, deciding to go, then gives the consolation prize to the captain of the white ship. of having William Atheling be one of his passengers. And there's huge excitement among the crew at this. William, as I mentioned, a teenager, very glamorous, blonde, surrounded by sycophants and hangers-on, and the young crowd, the sort of fast set of Henry I's court, they wanted to be with the future king. And so we know the guest list of the passenger list on the White Ship is incredibly heavy with names. We have 18 ladies of the rank of countess and above, which is about as good as you could get without being a princess. And then we have not only William on board, but two other royal offspring, an illegitimate son and illegitimate daughter of Henry I are on board, a nephew and a niece, the great heroes of the recent wars, and really significant landholders and aristocrats. And they all get on board. And then there's this sort of awful moment which we can recognize. It doesn't have to be 900 years ago. The sycophancy of the crew, they're so excited that they flatter the prince. And in return, he gives them a little largesse and doles out the wine that he's brought on board to the crew as well as his guests. And this is a disaster. And the eyewitness accounts have the crew as monumentally drunk. And when they push off to sea, probably a little before midnight, catching the tide when it was still good, they make a very big mistake. And that is that the cry goes out that they must try and catch Henry I's ship before it gets to Southampton on the south coast of England and beat him on the homeward journey. And so the 50 oarsmen bend their backs, and then the captain makes a fatal error by dropping the sail. Now, in traditional medieval navigation, you would not drop the sail until you were clear of the rocky coast. But I think they were just overexcited. People had lost their senses to a certain amount because of the drink. And the helmsman, I think, probably lost all sense of how fast they were going. The combination of the very strong rowing team and the sail meant that they went much faster than anticipated and hit a really sizable impediment outside Barflow Harbour, which is called the Keyberth Rock. Then it all goes very, very wrong very fast.
Yes, because I think nobody was expecting this. And I mean, there has been a lot of comparisons as you've been doing this book tour around the 900th anniversary, people comparing it to Titanic. And it's kind of the same thing where they are totally ill prepared, even though they know there are risks. And so they hit this rock that they actually know is there. And then what happens? They collide with the rock, and what happens next?
Yeah, you're so right. There is a comparison with the Titanic because it was the great shipwreck of its age. But I'm not saying this because I've written a book about it. It is so much more important than the Titanic. You'd have to have put the sole heir to the British throne on the Titanic, along with half the cabinet and great generals, et cetera, to have a direct comparison. So this isn't a battle of shipwrecks, but I just want to make the point that this is the worst shipwreck that England's ever suffered. And the reason is because when they hit the rock, everyone panics. So first of all, the sailors try to push off from the rock with their oars and with pikes. And all that does is open up the wound in the side of the White Ship even wider. Then people start to fall into the sea. And actually, one of the things I learned while studying this book is, these people did not know how to swim. Swimming was not a pastime. Very, very few people had the knowledge of swimming. And they had this terror of the sea. If you look at the poetry and the literature at the time, the sea is this enormous expanse of very great fear. It can be beautiful, but most of the time it's waiting to trip you up. There are actually quite a few shipwrecks in this book because they happened, because people had a very rudimentary knowledge of the sea. You had to be a seasoned captain to understand the tides around a particular harbour or where the rocks were. There was no excuse for that with this particular crew. They were a Barflow crew and they knew, but they had got drunk. Anyway, they start to fall into the water. There is one lifeboat on board that we know about, and the bodyguards surrounding the prince bundle him into it, and they're rowing him back to safety. By this stage, they're only a mile offshore. And in fact, the people in Barflow hear the scream of the passengers, but assume it's just the party going to a higher notch on board the White Ship, and nobody thinks that it's turned into a disaster. that yes, the rowboat is getting away, but we hear from Barreau the butcher from the city of Rouen, who has got on board the white ship to get some of his debts settled before these people disappear to England forever. What happened next? And he managed to clamber, Barreau the butcher managed to clamber onto a bit of broken mast and saw the disaster unfurling. And the prince was getting away when he heard the cries of his half-sister, the illegitimate daughter of the king. She's called Countess Margaret of Perche. And she calls for him to come and help. And she also screams insults about his manhood for going away while she's going to drown. So she lures him back. He insists they turn back. But of course, these people thrashing around in the freezing water in panic see possible salvation in the form of a little lifeboat. And they start to clamber on board. And as Barreau recalled, they all went down, including the prince. They drowned. At this stage, Barreau has a companion on his perch on the mast, and it is one of the great warriors of Henry's army, a man called de l'Aigle. And de l'Aigle and Barreau are lying in shock, I imagine, when they suddenly see bobbing in front of them the captain of the ship, and he asks, "Where's the prince?" And they have to tell him the prince has drowned. Now, Henry I was a very vicious figure, Mm-hmm. And at that point, the captain gives up the ghost and lets himself drown. They go through the night. By this stage, a lot of people have died of simple drowning. Others have died of cold water shock, which is when you go into convulsions and then panic and then you take water on board. And then the rest were finished off by hypothermia. I'm afraid de l'Aigle goes that way too, and he totters into the sea after a night of trying to stay awake and talking to Barreau. And Barreau is retrieved by 3 fishermen in the morning and has this terrible tale to tell of the great tragedy which has cost the king 3 children, including the one who dynastically really matters, and the cream of Anglo-Norman society.
Yes, I think that this is a story that you can't tell without understanding a little bit about things like the sea, a little bit about the effects of alcohol on the body, the effects of hypothermia on the body. And I've been thinking about it all week, obviously, thinking about how Barreau probably is there, trying to settle his debts. He's probably not drinking as much. And that probably is what saved his life in some ways, because, alcohol will suppress your shivering reflex. And he's probably, of the 2 people left on the mast, the one who's drunk the least, and that may have saved his life. But I was thinking about the people who went down with this ship. Didn't Henry's firstborn son, his illegitimate son, go down as well? Was it Richard of Lincoln?
Yeah, Richard of Lincoln was one of his eldest illegitimate sons. And he had just shown himself to be a particularly fine warrior, actually. He was in the forefront of the battle at Bremule in 1119. Great triumph of Henry I over the French. And he had a rich... the tragedy of this is that a lot of these were young people on this boat who had not only come from noble birth, but they had distinguished themselves when from more humble backgrounds. You're right, Barreau stands out as something completely different, because I don't know how he got on board, to be honest, because this was the royal aristocratic boat. And you're probably right, he probably wouldn't have been offered a drink by the sort of roistering upper classes, I suppose, as they would be seen at the time. But no, he died, Richard Lincoln, and he has had an incredible upbringing. So one of the things with Henry is that he is quite unusual for his time, because even before he became king, he was very happy to own up to fathering illegitimate children. A lot of people tried to sidestep this issue. In fact, we have a rather shameful episode with Robert Curthose, the eldest of William the Conqueror's sons, who had an affair with, the chroniclers say, a beautiful young woman. And she came to court eventually, demanding that he recognize the 2 sons that she had as his. And Curthose very ungallantly said, "Look, I don't know if I was the only lover at that time." And she has to take the ordeal by, white hot iron. She has to hold that. And terribly unfair, as your people will know, that if she got wounded by it, then she was guilty. If she didn't, she was telling the truth. And somehow she didn't come up with appalling wounds. And Robert then accepted these 2 boys as his. But Henry wasn't like that. He didn't put his lovers through that sort of torture. And he had a succession of lovers in Normandy and England, and 22 illegitimate children, which makes him the most fertile British monarch of all time. But interestingly, that the church rules at this time meant that none of them could be considered as heirs to the throne. I mean, William the Conqueror was famously known as William the Bastard because he was illegitimate. But things had changed a lot because the church had tightened up the rules on illegitimacy and many other moral points from the 1070s onwards. So yeah, he died. And the only way they could recognize Lincoln was he was only found after some time in the water, days. And people recognized him because he loved his clothes. And people recognized this extremely fine clothing on this corpse as having belonged to the illegitimate aristocrat.
Well, I brought him up because I think, as you're saying, Henry's children were all important to him, legitimate or not. And so when you think about this disaster in terms of how it affected Henry, he's not only lost the heir to the throne, which is a political disaster, but he's lost 3 children, including William, who was very precious to him as his heir, his only legitimate son. But this is a personal tragedy as well as a political one. So what was the impact of this tragedy on the English court?
Yes, well, you're absolutely right. We have letters from 1108 when Henry was fighting in France and Normandy, back to the Archbishop Anselm at the time, so asking him to keep an eye on his son because he was going to be absent and to please look after him like a father. So he really did care. And this is one of the reasons nobody rushed to tell Henry the news. First of all, he was a terrifying figure when he was in a good mood, really, but not much good in grief. He was a terrifying prospect. So what happened was the news that Barreau had to impart arrived in England, and people were at the court. He had retreated from Southampton, the harbour, to his favourite hunting lodge in the New Forest in southern England, waiting for his children and his courtiers to join him there. And then he gets this terrible news. Well, they do. And they don't want to pass it on, but it's very difficult to cover it up because nearly everyone of importance has lost either a relative or a friend, or actually a child or a nephew or niece because of the youth of the people who are lost. And they try to keep it quiet, but they realize this is impossible. And then eventually one of Henry's nephews decides that the news has to be broken. And he persuades a page boy to take the news to the king. And he does, and this poor page boy realizes that this news is catastrophic and blurts it out. And we have this terrible image of a man in agony, bellowing at the loss of his child and children and others, falling to the floor, and then being taken away to lie down and recover from the shock, crying for days in his bed, until one of his old, tough Norman retainers tells him that this is what women do, breathing like this, and he has to be a man and a king. It's all very of its time, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And that he would be playing into the hands of his enemies if they knew how he was reacting. And so his first job, Henry sees his first dynastic duty, by this stage he's been a widower for 18 months, is to remarry. And he has already, I think, has his eye on a young lady called Adeliza of Louvain. And she is known as the Fair Maiden of Brabant and was meant to be spectacularly beautiful. I'm always slightly suspicious of this because every chronicler, whenever they're writing about a king, a queen, or somebody incredibly socially important, they're always fantastically good looking. So you've got to put that with a pinch of salt. It was part of the flattery of record. Yes. But anyway, she does seem to have been. She was young and pretty, and hope, I'm afraid she was very much breeding stock for the king. That was the idea. And the chroniclers report how she spent a lot of time by the king's side. Well, we all know what that means, but it didn't work. I think possibly, who knows, perhaps the king was left impotent by grief. Also, he was an older man for that time. He was in his, I think he was about 52, 53. And and as time went on, of course, because of the ingrained misogyny at the time, Adeliza was assumed to be barren, She turned out not to be. Subsequently, she remarried and had 6 children. There were no further legitimate children. And as I've said, the illegitimate ones were not seen as potential candidates for the crown. And then Henry decides to persuade the barons and the bishops that the way ahead is for his daughter, Matilda, who has been widowed, she is widowed in the early 1120s, is a suitable successor. And he really spends the remainder of his reign trying to make sure that that comes about.
Yes. And one of the things I remember you saying on Instagram is like, you've talked to people before about the white ship and not everyone really knows about it. And it's actually such a pivotal point, because if it wasn't for the white ship, well, a whole lot of things wouldn't happen, including the anarchy. We haven't even talked about Stephen yet, but Stephen is getting to be a very important person at this moment in time. So tell us a little bit about Stephen of Blois.
Yes, Stephen of Blois was the king's nephew, and his mother, Adela, was the youngest daughter of William the Conqueror and was actually the favourite sibling of Henry I. She had ruled Blois while her utterly incompetent husband was on the First Crusade and had done a better job than he ever did. And we know she was highly able. Stephen inherited the sort of the charm of the family without much of the ability. People liked Stephen. They commented on how he could talk to anyone. For such a high-born, well, a member of the royal family, effectively, that he could talk to anyone, soldiers through to the king, with equal ease. And so also he had married a very impressive woman called Mathilde of Boulogne from Flanders. And Flanders and England had already established quite a profitable trade, particularly with London itself. And Stephen, when he heard of his uncle Henry I's death in December 1135, he sped across the Channel, Stephen, and arrived in London and had himself crowned very quickly. It's interesting at this time, possession of the crown was really 9/10 of the law, because there was this theory that if you were an anointed in a coronation, that you somehow were elevated from common humanity to be something more godlike. And he was very quick off the blocks, and the people of London were delighted to recognize a thoroughly nice chap who also had trade links with England through his wife as the king. And it's amazing to me how almost completely, but how quickly, all those people, all of the prime people in England and Normandy, forgot the oaths they had made at least twice to Henry I to honor his wish that his daughter should become successor. They just carried on. And it's astonishing, because she actually was incredibly able, Matilda.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I want to get into Matilda in a second, but Stephen was actually on board the white ship, wasn't he?
Yes. Now, when I was pitching this to my publishers, I said, look, at the end of the day, it's Titanic meets a Game of Thrones with an element sliding doors. And they got that. I'm not sure they got the medieval history so much, but anyway, they commissioned it. And the sliding doors element is all to do with Stephen, because he got on board the white ship. He was meant to be on it. He was meant to die on it. But right before it set sail, he gets off. And now there are two theories. One is that he had very bad diarrhea, and he didn't want the huge embarrassment of that on a closely packed ship on a 10 or 12-hour voyage north. And the other one is that he got very drunk with everyone else and got too drunk and had to be sort of taken off. Either way, it was very good luck. And he ends up being the one that got away, really. There were a couple of others, but he was the really important one who got off the white ship. And yes, he becomes king. He's got no agenda. One of the great things about Henry I is when he became king, he issued a coronation charter, which we would recognize now as some form of political manifesto. He swore to do certain things. And this actually, a lot of those were picked over by the people who put Magna Carta together in 1215. They used Henry I's charter as an example of some of the rights that had to be observed by the king. Stephen just came aboard as king and said, hey, everything's going to be great. And it wasn't. It just wasn't. And it revealed his hand. He had nothing to play, in card terminology. He was just a smiley, dim, upper class charmer. There was nothing. And this didn't really matter to start with. But as time went on, within 3 years, he had lost the respect of a lot of supporters. And, my theory is he didn't have to do a lot to stay uncontested, but the fact that he did so little let the door open on Matilda. And so 3 years later, in 1138, she decides to come across to England. And then people think, yes, we can support her because at least, we did swear that she was going to be queen, and she is an alternative to Stephen. And she has this wonderful ally too, because her mother, Matilda's mother, so therefore Henry I's wife, was a princess of Scotland. And that meant that at the time this was all going on, her uncle, King David of Scotland, who had sworn to uphold her as a successor, he invaded from Scotland, and she had very significant support, including her most able half-brother, one of the illegitimate sons of Henry I, who's the Earl of Gloucester, who's an incredibly powerful figure, who frankly would have made an excellent king in my humble opinion, but of course he's ruled out the illegitimacy. But he supports his sister, brings a huge amount of wealth and power. And but by early 1140s, Stephen's under a lot of pressure. He's captured at the Battle of Lincoln. And it's very difficult. Nobody really knows what to do with a captured king, so they keep him imprisoned. He refuses to wave the crown. And then the disaster happens in a reversal for Matilda. Her half-brother, the Earl of Gloucester, is captured, and there has to be, in this medieval game of chess, a king is swapped for a knight. And they end up back at each other's throats for quite some time. And, it's called the Anarchy. It wasn't called the Anarchy at the time. That's a Victorian name for this period, but it's very apt. I mean, it really was a complete breakdown of order. I don't think England in the last 1,000 years has experienced anything like it. Total carnage. And people look back to Henry I's rule with very rose-tinted spectacles. He was vicious, Henry I. If you messed him around, you were going to pay. If you were a man, it was eyeballs out and genitals off and maybe hands and all sorts of things being lopped off. But it did mean peace. And, to the average person in medieval England, that was a huge result and worth the pain of a very strong king. And people said, during Henry's time, a young maiden with a purse full of gold could walk from one end of the country to the other unmolested. Whereas in Stephen's time, you'd be lucky to get out the door. It was a time of total carnage and rape and pillage. And this was not acceptable. But eventually, the civil war between Stephen and Matilda settles into a deadlock, really, where Stephen controls the southeast and London, the east, and a bit of the north. And Matilda's forces, she's not always there, but her forces control the west and southwest, which are very important financially too. And I think essentially what happened was that both the church and the barons realized that this was just costing them too much in terms of money and lives. And they made the two parties reach an agreement. And the agreement was that Stephen could remain as this rather lame duck king on condition that he did not allow any of his children to succeed him. And in return, Matilda's eldest son, Henry, a Plantagenet from Anjou, that he would be the successor. So eventually, yes, Henry I's grandson did take the throne, but not in the way he'd have wanted. And the Plantagenets of Anjou were the mortal enemies of the Norman ducal house. So it was quite a compromise. And it was the end. In 1154, when Henry II becomes king, it is the end of the Norman dynasty. And the Plantagenet dynasty rules from then until 1485, when the Tudors take over. it's astonishing to think what one night in a ship and it going down achieved, or what it unsettled. It's absolutely, I can't think of a more seminal moment in English royal history than the sinking of the White Ship.
Yes. And so it's kind of strange that, it can be forgotten at times when you think about it directly led to, I think, 19 years of civil war and then an entirely new royal dynasty, which is the one that I think most people remember when they think back the Tudors and the Plantagenets, because the Plantagenets ruled for 300 years or something like that.
Yes, they are the big ones, and it is extraordinary to me that it is forgotten. So I don't know how this period's taught to medievalists internationally, and I'm sure you have to dig down yourselves to do it. But I'm in my mid-50s, and I was brought up in England when history was a compulsory subject. So yeah, I learnt about this, and it was only we all assume people know what we know, don't we, to a certain extent. And I was asked 5 years ago to go and give a speech at Leeds Castle down in the south of England, and it was on the Queens of England. And I was trying to explain something about Matilda, this great non-queen. And I gave the story of the White Ship, and I realized these people did not know really what I was talking about. There's a couple of people nodding, but really not many. And then I thought, wow, that's so strange, because it was such a searing memory. In fact, that bit of the prince going back for his sister in the rowing boat and going down was so seared into my mind. And actually, one of the first history books I read as a child was called Our Island Story. It will not be prescribed now because it's very imperialistic, a sort of celebration of England from the Roman times to the death of Queen Victoria, written in 1906 or something. Mm-hmm. But the chapter on Henry I, Henry I is one of our greatest kings. He set up the exchequer. He did all sorts of incredibly innovative and intelligent things. But in Our Island Story, he's basically suffering from the White Ship. And there's this wonderful illustration of the ship going down. And these things stay with you. And actually, I happened to Google. I was just thinking, I couldn't believe how people have forgotten it. Not from an intellectual snobbery thing at all, because I have no right to that. But just, what a sadness that it's been forgotten. And I Googled it 3 years ago, and that's when I saw the 900th anniversary was coming up, and that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, I remember learning about the White Ship, but more in passing. Like, it was on the White Ship that the prince was lost, and that led to civil war. But to think about the prince going back for his sister, and if he had not gone back for his sister, everything would have been different. And when you think about that being everything turning on a moment that's actually emotional and not, political, I think that it's so significant and definitely should be remembered.
Well, I think the other thing, just to round it all out, is the astonishing thing of having a king who has 24 children, but only one of them is a legitimate son. That was the problem for Henry. And, heirs to the throne did die. Louis VI's son died in a riding accident. He was riding through some rough part of Paris on his horse when a pig came running out from behind some rubbish that it was eating, and it tripped the horse up, and he died. So, people did die. And I was amazed by the accidental deaths in the New Forest, which I mentioned. So William the Conqueror was a passionate hunter. And one of the great things that he loved about having acquired England was not just the wealth and status it gave him, but the new hunting territory. Because in Normandy, it was a very fixed area because the barons weren't going to give up their privileges. But having conquered England, he could start again. And he despoiled villages, and he made it a crime to have a dog near his hunting grounds. And if you did have a dog, it would have to be mutilated so it couldn't chase the stags. I mean, all ghastly. But you got William Rufus, his favourite son, dying in a hunting accident in 1100, shot through the chest by a stray arrow. But earlier that year, another one of the royal illegitimate grandsons had died in a similar accident. And William the Conqueror, years before, lost another son, one who's really lost to history, a man called Richard of Normandy. He died squashed between a branch and his saddle. So accidents did really happen. And I think, it was quite, well, optimistic of Henry just to have one son. Although I gather his wife, his first wife, Matilda of Scotland, she was very religious, and I think she felt she had done her duty when she had the daughter, then the son. And I think after that, I think conjugal relations were over, and she went back to being a sort of almost a saint. Actually, her mother had been sanctified, and she was considered for sanctity after her death. But I don't think that was an option. And then, of course, he was old and depressed, and
Yeah, it, as you say, you think about history when you look back at it as being fixed, but when you're actually living in it, I mean, there are lots of kings who lost heirs along the way, including Henry II, who's just taken up the story for us.
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, yeah, Henry VIII had an elder brother, and Charles I had an elder brother who both died. It happened a lot. These very early mortalities, and I'm not saying Henry should have had more, but what I'm saying is twofold. One is that it would have been sensible to have had a spare, and, and then the other thing is it's very bad luck that he failed to have any son in the second marriage.
Yes, and because of that, we have legendary figures now from the Plantagenet dynasty to look at. And
I love the Plantagenets. Yeah, we can all celebrate the white ship on that basis.
In terms, if we really kind of step back and look at it just in terms of these are characters. But yeah, one of the things that I like about the book, and I'm glad you wrote the book, is you see them as people and you see this disaster as having a human face.
Well, I think that's the most important part for me about history. And look, there are academics listening to this who will think this is very shallow, but I do think it's about people watching. So when I write, I really like to get to grips with the characters, because that brings it alive for me, and I hope it does for the reader. But I think we mustn't just think of these as names on a page. They were people. And do you know what? They weren't that great, necessarily, just because they were king. And you have to put them into human terms and not put them on a pedestal. I mean, one of the things I find, because I write about great episodes in reigns, is that I don't care that the king was a weak human sometimes. I mean, that's really interesting. And it's just real, isn't it? I think we're way less deferential now. That when I look back at some of the past medieval historians, obviously their knowledge is fantastic, but the way they treat these people, they treat them as sort of icons, and they're on pedestals, and it's very bizarre because we accept everyone's human. It doesn't matter if it's a president or a king, they're human first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and exactly that's what determines a lot of the decision making, and I think that's really important to the story. And I'm glad of the way that you told this story. So I want to thank you for coming on the podcast to talk to me about the White Ship. Thank you, Charles.
It's a great pleasure, Danièle. Thank you.
To find out more about Charles's work, you can follow him on Twitter at cspencer1508. If you're interested in listening to our conversation on the night of the 900th anniversary of the White Ship disaster, check out his Instagram page with the same handle, cspencer1508. Charles's book is called The White Ship: Conquest, Anarchy, and the Wrecking of Henry I's Dream, and it's available now in the United Kingdom. For people in North America and elsewhere in the world who'd like a copy before it's published here, you can visit Charles's website, where you can even ask him to sign a copy for you. You can find it at charles-spencer.com/bookshop. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on these days, Peter?
Hey. Well, it was American Thanksgiving, so we always kind of load up the week. Nothing to do with Black Friday or Cyber Monday or anything like that, but give the readers what they want on the... So our writers came through, and we had a lot of really good pieces, so you can read about Finland in the Middle Ages, fishing in the Middle Ages, and a few pieces on food in the Middle Ages. So we've got that. Also, some really fun pieces like a survival guide to medieval fairy tales, Justinian's plague and the birth of the medieval world, and also essential hiking gear for a medieval Chinese monk.
Wow, those all sound really great. I have to say, when you were saying medieval food, all I could think of was like at every fair, there's always medieval turkeys, which we're laughing at because, Turkeys are North American, but those all sound really awesome hiking if you're a Chinese monk.
Yeah, and what you actually bring with you. So I really love Elizabeth Smith Rosser's articles. So it's like really fascinating, and she takes a particular image and kind of dissects it to show you all the different kind of things that the monk took, which included a tiger.
Well, naturally, everyone needs a tiger. Well, thanks, Peter. That sounds awesome. We'll check in with you next week.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of our patrons on patreon.com whose generosity makes it possible for me to create this podcast for you each week. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you'll be happy to know that we have all sorts of rewards for you, including subscriptions to Medieval Warfare magazine and the Medieval magazine, as well as our book club and our exclusive and seriously awesome maps by Tina Ross. Oh, and you also get my eternal gratitude. Find all the action at patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from hiking monks to sinking ships, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can follow me, Danièle Sobolski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books, including Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, at your favorite online bookstores. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.